Let's see what we mean by getting used to data being converted into JavaScript objects by looking at a common example. Let's look quickly at Node and MySQL. So on npmjs.com in the npm registry, I'll do a search for MySQL. And there's a really good package for using MySQL in Node. MySQL is an open source SQL database. And if you've done any web programming, you've probably used it or at least heard of it. And there's lots of different options when you're dealing with different databases usually. So we'll just use this one because it's the most popular. And you might be using a different database system. So you just need to look out there for the most popular, most well-used, most recognized as stable and useful Node package out on the npm registry for the kind of database that you're dealing with. But whatever kind of database, if it's a SQL database that you're dealing with, that tabular data, the data in tables, will ultimately be converted to JavaScript objects. And so it's important that when we receive that data, we're thinking in terms of JavaScript objects so that we can use it properly. And of course, that makes it easier to use as well. Let's go ahead and install this. npm install MySQL, and I'll save it to the package.json. It will install this, and that's just JavaScript code that enables us to connect to a MySQL database, run a SQL query, get the data back as JavaScript objects, and of course also add, update, and delete data. But we're just focusing right now on the idea of how we deal with data coming from a database where the data is stored in tables. So MySQL is now in my node underscore modules folder. It's also in my package.json. Now let's just grab it in console.log some data from my database. I actually have MySQL installed on my computer here. And I put together those three tables that we saw in the slides in the previous lecture. I ran a SQL statement for a test, and here it is. I have my data pulled together from those three tables. So this is the query that I'm going to run using the npm package for connecting to MySQL. I'll connect to this same database, get this data, just send this query, the same query, and see what that npm package does for me with that data. And this is just one of those things where you have to look in the documentation for whatever package it is you're using to see how to use it. For starters, I can require MySQL. It's in the node underscore modules folder, so that'll be found. And when I looked in the documentation for that particular npm package, I saw that it was pretty easy to connect. I'll go ahead and put it in my middleware so that when I run my app from the browser, I'm just going to go ahead and output the results to the console. So I'm just going to paste here basically what was there in the documentation for that MySQL package. This was how to create the connection. I named my variable MySQL that I got back from require, and it gave me a .createConnection that I sent an object to, which held the username and password and the name of the database. I made an address book database on my local MySQL box. I made a temporary user for the purposes of this course with a rather terrible password, but that's good enough just to try this out. And now I'm going to do something I don't usually do in this course. I'm just going to paste the code because we're more interested in the results. But to see what this did do, if you are interested in using MySQL with Express specifically, I could, for example, pass a query once I got this connection object that now holds the connection to the database, and I can send it a string, and it has various ways of manipulating this string for parameters and variables, and send it that same query. And when I get the results back, when that comes back, it's an asynchronous call. And when it's done, the callback will run, and the callback I give as a function. And I'm just giving it this function in order to respond to the data finishing. So this will be one of those events. The connection goes off and connects to MySQL, and when it's actually got some data, we'll see that this comes back. Let me format this a bit better. So this is a function. We check for an error. And for starters, we'll just output what comes back. So this is an error first callback. If there's an error, there will be an error there. If not, we'll console.log the second parameter, which will be what comes back from the database. And remember, what's coming back from the database really is data that's in a table. But let's see what MySQL actually does with this as far as the MySQL Node package that is connecting to the MySQL database, getting that tabular data. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. So I'll say nodemon app.js. That starts running. And I'll just do localhost 3000. And so the page ran, so that middleware should have ran. And there it is. Now notice what it did. MySQL, the database, did send back tabular data. And this package, this npm package, took that data and converted it into a JavaScript array. Notice the brackets there. And it's an array that holds an object for every row in the table. And this is absolutely fantastic, because that means all we have to think about now when it comes to using our data is what would I do with a JavaScript object, and we know how to deal with that. So it's not some special thing that comes back from the database that you have to learn to use. It's just JavaScript objects, and that's pretty much the way all of the various utilities to connect to databases in Node work. So I could just get the first row, for example, and output the first name. And so if I go ahead and do that, nodemon caused that to restart when I made that change. I'll refresh, and there's the first name of that first item in the array. In other words, the first row that came back and that field, that column, which really is now a property of that object. So I could loop across this. I could send this over to my view, for example, like we do with EJS, and send it across with the model. I could have this be something that happens in one of the .gets on the app, and simply use that as the data that I display. I could have this sent back via JSON to the browser and let the browser take this data and decide what to do with it in JavaScript on the browser. In fact, this particular package has the ability to stream rows. So we're sending chunks at a time straight from the database and pipe it out to the HTTP response. So, pretty simple. But the goal here, the idea that I wanted to make sure you have in mind, is one that confuses people at times. What's coming back from any SQL database like MySQL or SQL Server or another database like that, even though it's tabular data, a good utility being used by Node will end up giving you back simply arrays of JavaScript objects. So just think of them as objects because that's what they are, and then you know how to manipulate them because you know how to access arrays and properties on JavaScript objects. Make sense? All right, so this was a very simple example, but you can imagine how powerful this can be. And of course, there are ways of updating the database as well, deleting data from the database, etc. So this is enough to get this idea. Now, I also want to show you another idea, one that has nothing to do with SQL databases. In fact, quite the opposite.